as Dr. Chomsky was talking about the ways in which then there are actually pull factors bringing, in this case, immigrants, right, into our schools and communities that oftentimes we're unaware of. So then our neighbors construe them as sort of a hostile, criminal, invading force, right, causing this anti-immigrant sentiment, when in fact there are structural forces that have quite logically, right, brought them to our doorstep. And without knowing that, it's easy to put those families, those youth, on the outer periphery of our universes of obligation as educators. And once we're aware, once we know these histories, then we are notified of our involvement and our responsibility to think about how we can build bridges and bring them into our universes of obligation in really conscious ways. So I wanted to just start there because that highlights then my interest in working with Emily and Margaret in bringing Facing History and Ourselves to you as a way of grounding the work that otherwise might get called cultural proficiency work, giving you a new way to think about what cultural proficiency might mean. And if you could really see these slides, you'd see that I've chosen slides that have sort of big green, leafy, grassy looking things, and I did that on purpose to really emphasize how the way that I'm going about this work with Emily and Margaret is to be sort of in the work with you, doing it in a ground up kind of perspective instead of a top down perspective. So it really is a project, even though I call it the Salem Project, because in my head that's what I call it. Kind of sounds like the Blair Witch Project or something. It should. I don't want it to sound that this is much more, much less scary, right? But there is the witch connection. It really is something that we're just building as we grow. So you are authentically a part of this building process. And when I think about and talk about the Salem Project, I talk about it as being a project around culture, inquiry, and school community change. And the connection here to Boston University and the Massachusetts Institute of Career and College Readiness is that when we're thinking about equity and socioeconomic outcomes for youth and families around college and career, that starts in homes and classrooms, and culture is an integral part of that. So to sort of bring those ideas that can sound like they're about kids when they get all the way to the end of K through 12, but instead help us think about then those processes in youth and family lives and our own teaching practices that set the groundwork for what's their pathway through our classrooms and our schools. So, my role is, as I understand it, and Emily and Margaret chime in otherwise.
If you're wrong.
I know. To support your professional community of learners in collaboratively investigating, implementing, and sharing best practices that grow and sustain equitable Salem schools. And I'll tell you right away that I don't have the teaching credentials that you have. I've never been a teacher in charge in a classroom. I spent time as a bilingual instructional aide, so I have spent time in schools, and I've done a lot of work with teachers in schools, but I absolutely acknowledge there's a difference between your work and my work, and what I'm trying to do is share then what I can offer, which is a vision of your work through an anthropology perspective, and have that as a tool that I would hope that you would find useful as you move into this next opportunity that I'm hoping is being presented to you through this Salem project. So before today, had anybody ever heard anybody talk about educational anthropology? No, right?
No.
Yeah, right. And these are actually kind of kissing cousins, because anthropology is usually considered sort of like the ugly stepson, let's say, of the social sciences. It doesn't get a lot of cred, just like education. is also considered sort of an ugly stepson, let's say, of the social sciences. So you bring them together and you have an area of study that's really at the periphery of a lot of people's attention. It is a thing, actually. And it began at a meeting of anthropologists and education researchers in 1954. And the underlying point of departure is that classrooms are places of cultural contact, where cultures, right, come into contact, potentially come into conflict, and always of cultural change. Because you can't have contact or conflict without actually some new cultural form emerging. And it's what we do with those new cultural forms that's the invitation into our conversation this afternoon. George Spindler is now considered the founder of Educational Anthropology. And he talked about this work as cultural therapy, actually. He said what we need in the United States is cultural therapy. That he called it the referent ethnic class, which is a way of talking about middle class, white, Protestant, monolingual, English-speaking, right, people need to re-understand who they are. And he talked about this, that teachers need this in order to be better teachers for all kids in their classrooms. And then Ruth Landis expanded on this by actually saying we need to do this work not for teachers or to teachers, but we need to do this work as action research with teachers. Okay? And that certainly gets us back to this idea of wanting to be in the weeds with you and doing this work from the ground up. So remember, you had these anthropologist hats on before you went on your community walk with Dr. Chomsky. And just if you probably took those off while you ate lunch, but now I really want you to put those back on. And we're going to do some sort of checking in with things that we observed, and I cued you to think about things that you saw, things that you heard, maybe things that you smelled before you went on the walk. And here I'm giving you a couple more prompts. And so we're going to do this individually first. It's just on a sheet of paper, working solo. I want you to think about things that you observed, that you noticed on that community walk, things that caught your attention. And if it's helpful, you can just make a kind of a running list and then maybe think about parsing out some of these different environments, or you could use these different kinds of environments to make your list. But think about things that you observed in terms of the natural environment. So that's like nature, right? What did we notice about the presence of nature in the neighborhood walk? What did you notice about the constructed, that's like the human-made environment, buildings, sidewalks, kind of that kind of constructed infrastructure? And then think about what you observed in terms of social environments, and what I'm getting at there is the idea of relationships among people or beings, humans and other living beings. And so without saying anything more, with your anthropologist hats on, I'm going to give you just 2 minutes, maybe, to just kind of get back into that walk and make a list of things that you observed. It may not be that everyone shares out, but what I want to do is make sure that we compile a list that represents items from all of the lists in the room. So as somebody shares something out, for example, if you have that on your list or something similar, you can kind of cross it off, right? We don't need to share it again, obviously. So the idea is to build then a list that reflects all of the different kinds of noticing that we did. So people can call things out. I am going to write things down, so there'll be a little bit of a delay. So don't call things out too quickly, because I do want to get your observations down as you've expressed them. So somebody kick us off. What should we put on our what we noticed list?
We saw the mural.
Okay. Okay. Do you want to say more about what kind of mural?
Look very people of a certain ethnic definitely not white.
We'll just leave that for now. What else is on our list that we noticed?
New construction.
What's that? New construction. Okay. What else?
The Polish section seem to have more to offer the public at large than the points, and it seems its insularity.
To have more to offer. And you noticed its insularity? So,
Well, I think the point is more insular and makes that a point. And so there's really nothing there in that square mile or so that the normal person, well, the white person would come to versus they may go to things in the Polish section.
so I'm just going to try to get this down. Because of the point's insularity, is that the word, the point?
Seemingly.
Okay, right. Same, okay. Okay, what else? There are lots of hands over here, actually, yeah.
The small bodega was really.
Okay, so the,
Store
okay.
next to the barber shop that really didn't have.
And you said the really small bodega, right? What else? Yeah, maybe I'll kind of move like this so you'll know I'm coming. Yeah.
Like repurposing of older buildings into newer.
So,
A lot of renovation work, but also older buildings, just like seeing the one there that's in 1924, the charter school now being used for something different, but historically old buildings being used in current.
okay. Okay, yeah.
People living close together.
Okay.
The cleanliness on Congress Street is more trash visible as opposed to on Derby Street.
Okay, so the cleanliness of, what's the street?
Congress Street.
Congress?
versus Derby, yeah.
Is it Congress?
Congress is the one,
Con-
yeah.
That he's talking about? Okay.
Yeah, we're on
It's
there.
just because I'm not a Salem person, so Congress Street
Yes.
versus, and then what did you say?
Like Derby Street with more trash receptacles.
Did you say trash or trash receptacles?
Yeah.
Or both?
Yeah, those places to put waste.
Okay. On Derby?
Yes.
Receptacles on Derby. Okay. I'll come this way and know that I'll come around again. Yeah.
Two things about people, there weren't any children out playing in the neighborhood, actually in either of the neighborhoods. And also the one family that I did see that was crossing the street was a Latino family, and the little girls had white blonde dolls.
Okay. So, Latina girls with white blonde dolls. Okay. Anybody else at this table? Coming over here? No other hand? Yeah, and then I'll come back there. Yeah.
When we were walking through the point, there are a lot of chairs outside of the houses, and I think that suggests that there's a lot of frequent families sitting outside. I mean, I know that happens too. I'm kind of cheating here, but everyone comes outside and sits in their chairs. It's very like community driven in that sense.
And that was even depicted on the mural. There's the sitting outside.
Okay.
And all the decks, right?
Okay. Just a connection here to some decks. Okay. Now we're coming back here. Yeah.
I noticed there was one area, it looked like it was a playground. It was paved over, had a bunch of little spots for Foursquare, but it was erupting with overgrowth from the grass, just cracking through it. It looked like it hadn't been maintained in some time.
Okay. So
just, I guess, unmaintained public space.
okay. So yeah, not maintained public space. Okay. I saw your hand and.
So I saw a bunch of brick buildings that looked like they were constructed at different periods of time. And I also saw a lot of triple-decker buildings that were really tightly built right next to each other.
Okay, so different buildings at construction era, and you said triple
And
deck-
triple deckers, built really close to each other.
Okay. Triple decker built really close to each other. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to do kind of one more sweep. Yeah.
Here on Congress Street area, the vista is all roads lead to the mill, and out on Derby, it's how can we take advantage of this beautiful ocean scene? Just in where the houses, how the houses are constructed on their lots.
So on Congress, all vistas or point to the mill? Is that what you?
Well, yeah, I mean, you can't see anything but the mill.
Okay, all
There's
vistas.
no ocean view at all.
Yeah. Point to mill. Whereas on Derby,
The houses are positioned so that
Okay.
you have the harbor.
okay, versus on Derby, more view. Okay. Yep.
There was, even though we didn't see any, there was evidence of children in the point, whereas there wasn't in Derby Street. We could see there was like a little fleet of plastic trucks and things outside the houses.
So evidence of children in the point?
Yeah.
In the point, and what did you say? You said a fleet of plastic trucks? Okay. Yeah.
Derby Street's been developed to encourage and attract tourism, whereas the Point neighborhood hasn't.
And what's the evidence of that?
Well, they have little shops that are actually tourist shops, and gift shops and stuff. And then there's also that museum, the Polish Museum. Where is the museum? Is the museum in the Point? There's one, we didn't see it. They have the national park over on Derby Street. Everything is set up to encourage tourists to go to Derby Street.
Okay. Yeah, I'll do this row and then we'll go to the next
I had
step.
observed this even growing up, but I noticed that the trolley doesn't even come up Congress. It cuts through Eastern Bank, down the harbor, and then it goes up Derby Street again.
So the trolley doesn't come up. And what did you observe today that made you think about that?
Oh, no, it happened right in front of me, so
Okay.
it brought me back to
Okay.
seeing that growing up as a kid.
So you saw that? Yeah. Good, yeah.
Well, the Point is a neighborhood, and so I was thinking about the plaque about the neighborhood. So I was walking through. I was looking for what makes a neighborhood, and what makes this a neighborhood as opposed to like Derby Street being a public street, and so I was looking for some mailboxes and people's names on the mailboxes and cars lining the street that are clearly cars that belong to people who live there. Active work on buildings where people are living. Windows, air conditioners in the windows.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it had all the neighborhood elements, as opposed to public ways, like here to like shop, or it was a neighborhood, because people lived there. And there's evidence of their lives.
Yes, yeah.
Little to no green space.
Okay. Right, I'm running out of room, so now we know we're gonna stop, right? Okay. So now, what we're gonna do together is, and this is, maybe I need to move this a little bit closer to you all. So that I'm not the only one that can try to read my messy handwriting. Look at the list that we've generated here. And what I want you to do now is help me make sense with you about a fundamental piece of anthropological activity. And that is, anthropologists, we're interested in what we observe, or what is to be observed. We're interested in interpretation, first and foremost, of what we observe. And sometimes, lots of times, anthropologists are interested in the way that we, people, oftentimes move very, very quickly from observation to interpretation. And so if you look at the observations that we've made here, right? If you can help me talk with you all about where we see some of that happening just in that initial response to this prompt over what you observed. So let me give you an example. Like a comment, right, about a really small bodega. So what's the interpretive element of that observation?
Can't afford to have a bigger shop.
Okay, so that's even going even for, like a further into analytical. What's the interpretive element? Small, right? This idea of really small. What is really small?
It's gonna be compared to something else.
What is really small? If I asked each one of you right now about a definition of really small, we'd have how many definitions of really small in the room? Okay. So in this way, we as human beings move very quickly from the work of observing and go right into the work of interpreting, and we're often not aware of it, right? And so let's look at some others, right? And then there's another kind of piece about the more analytical, but let's hang on to that for a minute, right? So kind of go to this. There's observation, there's sort of the immediate impulse, interpretive impulse, and then there's kind of the analytical, right, work too. So what else? Do we have another example that's like this one? That's like in the language actually of the observation there was interpretive coding.
Really close.
Okay, so this idea of people living close together.
Buildings being really, triple deckers being really close to each other.
Okay. Yeah, and if I had an assistant, I could do this more.
Right there, right.
Okay, triple built really close to each other, right?
I can
So
assist you.
Well, you can't read my handwriting. True. Yeah. So you get to sit down. You have to watch your ankles. She's in a strenuous reading club, so she hurt her ankle.
book club.
Yeah. So this idea of really close together. So if I were to ask you, when is something really close to another thing? Right? Your answers would be really varied depending on where you come from, right? And what your experience was. So what's another one? Can we find another one?
What about the cleanliness of Congress versus the?
Okay. So this idea of cleanliness.
There's still just as much. There's plenty of trash all over every other part of the
Yeah.
street, and I don't even know if it's safe to assert that there's more or less receptacles. You know, because it seems like certain parts of Salem, even the alleged white areas, you know, I still find myself just on my daily walks, like picking up trash constantly, no matter where I'm at in Salem.
Okay. And again, so if we said, you know, what makes something go from a state of cleanliness to a state of not cleanliness?
Pride.
Would we be able to agree on that? Right? And if we had to tell stories about where our ideas come from, it wouldn't take too long for us to get back to, well, my neighborhood, right, where I grew up or where I live, right? So let's do just a couple more.
More to offer.
So where's that one?
Seeming to have more to offer on top of the
Third one
section.
down.
Oh,
Third one down.
Okay. More to offer. Yeah, so what does more to offer mean? Are we talking about human resources, friendships, right?
Well, tangible shops, you know, like the Polish section starts with the tourist attractions. And as you go deeper, they're still pretty close.
Yeah.
And they have pride in their sidewalks and so I'm thinking way ahead. If you could apply that to the point area and give each landlord the ability to say, okay, you'll get extra points on your taxes if you appoint one person in your building to serve as curb appeal manager.
And so that's right, that's an example of a particular sort of attachment or understanding of more to offer, right? Does it mean where those things aren't present that there's necessarily less to offer, right, in those? There's a particular understanding of what's valuable about what's being offered, right?
And to who, yeah.
And to whom, right?
Right.
Oh, so let's do one more, if there is one more.
Good shops.
Good shops. I remember writing that one. I was like, well, this is a good one, right? The idea of, Derby's been developed to attract tourism. There's good shops. Good to whom, right? And I'm noting here like the idea of, and I wrote it as like frequent families sitting outside, but it's families sitting outside frequently, I think is the way that was intended. And again, frequency, right? So the point of doing this is to show how close our own interpretive lenses are. And our interpretive lenses are the thing that helps us see our own cultural context at play, right? Every minute of our lives, we toggle very quickly between observation, interpretation, and then then our own analytical ideas about these things. And we could probably write a really interesting sort of expose on what we understand about then the point. So based on our observations, how could we describe the point? And then based on our interpretations, how could we describe our, right, understanding of the point, right? And those would be stories connected in one way, right, but disconnected in another way. And so this is what the work then of anthropology in education has to offer. So let me move this back. Is this way of alerting ourselves to the culture that we're bringing in at play in our classroom. So when we're talking about cultural proficiency, it's not then, and I know now I'm moving ahead of my slides, not there yet, that when we're talking about cultural proficiency, oftentimes the way that professional development around cultural proficiency works, not all the time, but oftentimes, there's this idea of culture as being a particular thing, and usually it's race, ethnicity. Right? And there's a reason, historical reason, for why that particular identity category is something that we attend to, right? But that's a really sort of one way of understanding becoming culturally proficient. And when you understand it just that way, what PD ends up looking like is, here's what you need to know about working with African American youth and families. Here's what you need to know about working with Latino youth and families. Here's what you need to know working with Asian American youth and families. Here's what you need to know about working with Native American youth and families, as if every individual within that racial ethnic identity group can be summarized by a checklist that a teacher learns and is somehow supposed to dictate how they interact, right, in their classroom. So anthropology takes a much more intersectional view of identity. So race ethnicity is there. It's an important, as we just learned, right, part of US history. But so is gender, so is class, so is ability, so is religion, so is language. And each of our identities comes out of the intersection of all of those, as do our students. So there's a multiplicity of identities in play all the time in any classroom. And then the job of the teacher turned anthropologist is not so much to be looking at kids as pertaining to a particular social identity, but be attending to how that cultural contact, conflict, and change is playing out in your very particular context, right, that's yours, and nobody else knows it better than you do. So George Spindler, who I mentioned in the earlier slide, is considered the father of educational anthropology, talked about a goal of transcultural sensitization. And it's a technique that he used with teachers to alert them to the way that their own cultural lenses were playing out in their teaching and learning. And so I just want to give you a sense of what this technique is like, to just, again, kind of get you thinking about your work through an anthro of ed lens. So he says one way that transcultural sensitization works is to illuminate how there's a stereotype of experience related to an event, object, or situation that's patterned in the observer's culture, right? So the stereotype is coming from the person who's doing the observing, right? And we then use those to not just observe the world, right, but to interpret the world. And so let's take this idea of an event, right? So a stereotype of an experience of an event. So we could take schooling. So oftentimes when we talk about schooling, we actually bring to that a stereotype of what that experience is. And so I'm talking about schooling as a series of events, right? Not just an event that unfolds over a lifetime. And if you come from white, middle class, monolingual, English-speaking culture, then schooling looks a particular way. And if you've come up in the United States, then you have a sense of how the grade levels work, and you have a sense of when you get promoted, and what the graduation ceremony looks like. You have a sense of the way that you're supposed to be when you go to school, right? But when we talk about schooling with families and youth that haven't done schooling in the United States, they haven't been socialized into this stereotype like I have. So even something as basic for educators as schooling is a place around which there's actually this interpretive work happening, where we're really bringing our own understanding of what schooling is into a conversation. And our youth and families may not share that same, right, stereotype of the event of schooling, because in Mexico, in the work that I've done in rural communities in Mexico, it's a whole different understanding of what schooling, what grade levels are available in the community, what grade levels you're expected to go to, what the role of the teacher is, how authority works, how many resources there are in the classroom. It's a different event, okay? So let's do another one. So another way that Spindler talks about transcultural sensitization is to talk about, it illuminates a stereotype of the experience of the meaning. So it's not just what the event is, but what it means, what the meaning is of the event, object, or situation as it's presumed to exist in another culture. So we presume that then somebody in another culture has the same meaning around, and in this case, let's use an object like books. Okay? So again, in white middle class homes, I grew up in a home with two college-educated parents. I was surrounded by books. And we didn't have the internet. I just read. I read and I read and I read, and books were a form of cultural wealth for me. You go to rural communities in Mexico, the only book oftentimes that you'll find in the house is the Bible. And oftentimes when I bring books down to those communities, I find my own interpretive lens firing, because there's not the anticipated way of people receiving books. Youth don't use books the same way that there's not that, let's sit on my lap and let me read you this book, this very middle class orientation towards literacy. Kids might pick the book up, they might not know, which way to hold it. They may, if they've been exposed to magazines, they may start ripping at it. It doesn't have the same experience of meaning. That object doesn't. Books just may have a different value, right, to people. That's different than the value that they might have to us. So let's take another. So Spindler also talks about transcultural sensitization, illuminating how there's a projection of emotional states around an event, object, and in this case, situation, as ascribed to subjects in another culture. So this is our way of saying, I feel this way about something, so they must too. And right, the example here is back to school nights. And oftentimes, I hear from the teachers, the in-service and the pre-service teachers I work with about, geez, these families never show up to back to school nights. They just don't care about schooling, right? We're projecting that emotional state of non-caring onto others using our own, right, equation of that as a way that you demonstrate care is that you go to back to school nights. But that's a projection onto somebody about whom we know nothing, really. And to give you a more grounded example, do you remember Brian's blood sugar story yesterday? Where, let's try to remember this, where he would be hungry, right, and start to feel a little gnarly, and then the kids would come back from lunch, right, and then they'd have lots of energy. And he was like, why are these kids so crazy after lunch? And you almost, I might be stretching a little bit, but almost a sense like they're misbehaving. Why are they doing this? And then he realized, well, they've just eaten, right? So they've got this energy. But this way then of easily attributing beyond just an observation of behavior to some sort of attribution of meaning. And oftentimes it might be of malice, that somehow they're doing this because they want to, right? Drive me crazy, okay? So Ed Anthro attends to these kinds of processes and helps teachers have language and tools and permission to explore their classroom as cultural spaces, right? And especially for white teachers, that might sound really like nobody's ever asked you to think about your classroom, if you work especially with all white students, as a cultural space. That might feel really new, or not. So let me talk a little bit more. How are we doing? We doing okay? Okay, so I've talked to you about interpretation, and now I want to talk to you about this idea of transitions and how the idea of transitions can help us make sense of cultural contact, conflict, and change. Well, and also I would just say, this is where it's actually harder. Because if we say, okay, somebody else has defined cultural proficiency for me as being this, and it's this list of behaviors, and I'll kind of show you an example maybe later. You may say, well, that's easier, actually, I'll just try to do these things. But you also, and we know, because we know that this is what teachers do, is that educators don't like it when somebody comes in from outside, right, and says, this is what you need to do without honoring your expertise, right? But when we want to claim our expertise and we want to sort of buck those easy systems that are really easy for somebody to just come in and say, do this, and put ownership, right, on ourselves, that's harder. And so there's this sense where this is where you all are given permission to go about the work of thinking about cultural proficiency differently, and it's going to require you, maybe, depending, because I don't know, this is an interpretive lens, to do some work that may feel harder, in that people aren't telling you how to do it, they're instead giving you permission to sort of say, what do I want to do and why? See what I'm saying? So, okay.
Harder but more supportive, I promise.
Yeah. So to just give you a sense of then how educators use these ideas. And so this comes out of a book, it's not my work, it comes out of a book called Adolescents' Lives, Multiple Worlds Model, something like that. I can get it to you if you're really interested. But what you can see that this visual is trying to do is represent to us the understanding that, in this case, let's put a student right in the self there, that in that young person's lives, right, they are nested in various other worlds beyond just school, for example. They've got their peer world, they've got their family world, And importantly, given the conversation that we had this morning and actually the last 2 days, all of this is grounded in a larger socioeconomic community that has a history, right? And all of these processes are present, right, in these multiple worlds. And the idea here of transitions connects us back to this idea of interpretation, because as students, in this case, move from their own individual understandings of themselves out into their family spaces, into their school spaces, into their peer spaces, they're making transitions between different worlds, and those worlds have different interpretive lenses that are used to understand who they are and that are available for that young person to use, right, themselves to understand who they are. And in these transitions are the things that we're talking about as cultural contact, cultural conflict, or change. And the authors of this book, and I'll get more into, or show you this if we have time later, do case studies of students and students' transitions, and these are students of color, and identify the kinds of strategies that students use in making these transitions, and come up with an understanding of sort of the consciousness of students around their work in navigating transitions. And those that are conscious of the fact that they're making transitions and have developed strategies to actively transition tend to have better outcomes in K through 12 schooling than those students who aren't really thoughtful or aware of the transition work that they're asked to do and have not developed active strategies. And so, you know, this idea of transitions invites you to think about how, as a teacher, you can assist young people in understanding their transitions and giving them strategies, or helping them identify strategies in making those transitions. Okay, so here's another question for you all. So thinking about examples of our last day's conversations, and particularly like the way we ended yesterday, you all were looking at some sort of case material from Facing History and Ourselves. So what are some ways that educators, so here I am using that language more broadly, the youth they work with, you work with, and their families experience transitions between multiple worlds? So if I put this on, this visual back on, if you can just think, to just ground us, like we've been talking about this actually, but now I'm giving you, this is what academics do, right? Then we're like, and here's a big way of understanding this all through this model, you know, but you've been doing this work already. I'm just naming it differently. And so if some of you can give us examples then of what you've already been talking about in terms of these transitions that are at play in the work that you do between these multiple worlds. And that's why I'm going to put this back up, if it's helpful. And maybe 3 or so examples, so we do have a sense that it's connected back to the conversations that you've been having.
So I may be a little confused on the prompts.
Okay.
Can you go through that one more time?
Yeah. Okay, so using this as a way to think about the work that you do in moving across these multiple worlds, and then remembering, I'm thinking particularly of the group work at the end of yesterday, where there was some, what would you do in this situation? Do you remember those?
Yes.
Okay. Then thinking about those might be places where you are actually having conversations about transitions between multiple worlds, or not, but thinking maybe.
So
Yeah.
something along the lines of like students hanging out with their friends out of school time, and then using like certain language with their friends that's acceptable within that group, but then in school trying to use that same language, but it's not acceptable in a school setting. So then as an instructor, as a teacher, you have to have that conversation about how to, you know, translate that language in a better way.
And so,
like
I mean, so
usage.
you've named a transition. So we have a youth, right, moving from their pure world into the school world, And then kind of what we do about it is a little bit beyond actually where we need to be right now. But that's right. That's the way that as an educator you'd be thinking. Like, so do you have a role to play in that or not? And what would that be? But that child, right, is experiencing a transition between worlds, and what that child does with that, right? There's variety, I'm sure, in what you've seen of how a youth decides to make that transition completely, or not make that transition completely, or kind of straddle both worlds in both spaces, potentially. So does that help? Maybe?
Sort of.
Yeah.
Then to kind of jump off that, then I think just from our position as classroom teachers, or from whatever position we are, I mean, we're bouncing between those worlds really constantly, and I'm very cognizant of, I tell my students all the time, like, how I speak to you and how you talk to me are very different than the ways that I address my family or I address my friends. Those are three completely different sets of language that I use. Almost, I wish there was a way, like, I don't know if it's necessarily a bad thing that they're sort of separate. I think that is necessary in my sense, but again, are we just identifying our specific trait, I guess?
Yeah, I'm trying to get examples. So I'm
Okay.
trying, like, I don't want to go all the way to here's what we do about it, but here's just an example of how this is this actually is a phenomena that is real in our lives. So I saw your hand, and then we'll go here and there.
Graduation from high school.
Okay.
An example of transitioning. Is that what you're looking for?
Well, so in terms of multiple worlds,
Yep, so you're going from school,
from like a particular kind of school world.
yep, to an adult, supposedly,
Okay.
adult world, which may include work, it
Okay.
may include college, it may not include college, it may
Okay.
include a training program, it may include travel, it may include.
And then the getting back to like the idea of stereotypes of experiences and meanings around that will depend, right, on the family context of the youth, how they understand what that transition from K-12 world to, right, post-secondary world, right? There's different cultural contexts about what that means that are different between educators, the family, potentially the child.
And socioeconomic need and.
Right, and that's
Sort of thing.
and that's the role of the larger socioeconomic context in structuring, right, the opportunities available in that transition space. So your hand went up back here.
So I was looking at families in school, so I was kid walk past my head thoughts when I was thinking of there's a difficult transition from getting to school, leaving family,
Okay.
getting that transition.
So moving from the family world into the school world, and
The physical and mental and emotional transition of that.
and what we know is that schools, on purpose, right, reflect white middle class culture, what Spindler called the dominant referent ethnic class. So a lot of the literature in multicultural ed, in anthro of ed, is how the movement from the family world to the school world for kids that grow up in white middle class homes is pretty smooth, not all the time, but a lot of those practices from school have made it back into the family home, and those kids have been prepped, right? But for families that aren't members of the dominant referent ethnic class, this transition is to a different world with different practices, values, beliefs, and expectations for what constitutes mastery. You know? Yeah, let's do like a couple, just so we have a sense of like how this is a model that actually does reflect our experiences. Did you have something else?
Yeah, I was just thinking of an example that I see sometimes as an administrator during discipline is if a student gets into a fight, sometimes they're conflicted between what they've been told to do at home if they get in a fight and then what the expectations are at school. So, and then the parent will come in and say something, I've heard it, I can count many times, well, I tell my son that if somebody hits him, it's okay to hit back. And then I have to have the conversation with the parent and the child, listen, those are the expectations, this is a different environment. So I'm just kind of thinking of the student being stuck in between those two worlds and not having, not understanding, or which side do I pick, or school's telling me to do this and my mom's telling me to do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it can be really important to also look at this, even taking the students out of it, and just look at it in terms of an adult community, and that as adults,
the ways in which we transition between these things, and particularly like in a school building, even within that one school, you interact in multiple different contexts with different peoples, and you have to learn how to code switch in those environments. And I think as we're approaching the beginning of the school year, we're going to have new teachers in our buildings, whether they're new to the building or new to the profession. We're going to be a new community every time we start a school year. How really important it is to be really cognizant and I think clear with people about that sort of hidden curriculum, right? That sort of when such and such happens, this is what it means. You know, this sort of being as transparent as possible at the beginning so that everyone can start off with a clear understanding of what they're doing, because every teacher brings their experience, or administrator, or whatever your position is, you bring in the experience that you've had before, whether it's at home or with your peers or in other schools.
Yeah. And so that's a really great point too, to acknowledge that actually, right, we all do this. So when we're talking about an anthro of ed model and a multiple worlds model, we're not just talking about these as processes only for these other kids and families. Like, this is a human experience actually that we all border cross, but you fold in the power and historical context here, right? And for those that aren't members, right, of the culture of power, these transitions are marked, right? They're hard, they constitute more work. But it's not that we don't do this too. Okay? Yeah.
And we're not always successful at it, right? And we are also new, you know, I think anytime when there are new people, new to anything, it's a responsibility of everyone around them to help navigate this.
So this again, like now we're going to get into like, what does this mean for what we should do, right? And I already feel you're like okay, so this is what we should do based on, which is where we're going, So let me get us there. Okay, so I already asked you that question. Okay, so facing history, just let me take a peek at the evaluations yesterday, and there was one question that asked about like, how is this work helping you think or talk about or identify some questions that you have about your practice. And these are statements then that come from you that really are naming ways in which these transitions are already on your radar. So there was the, how do I navigate language barriers and family structures other than mine? That's a multiple worlds crossing transitions question. How do I make my academic goals for my students align with theirs? That's a multiple worlds transition question. How do I make sure that a student understands acceptable versus non-acceptable behaviors? Multiple worlds transition question. How do I grapple with social religious issues that clash with my curriculum? Right? So already you were thinking yesterday about this transitional work. Okay, so now we're getting into we are going to have you be much more concerted about fine-tuning these questions, and we're getting there. So as I said earlier, an anthro of ed perspective then enhances, right, this is my hope, then the work that you are doing around cultural proficiency or cultural responsiveness, because it can complexify identity. We're not talking about people as, right, just representatives of some monolithic, cultural identity, but it complexifies what identity is, which feels truer for us. I know that even when I go to trainings about cultural proficiency, there's so many ways in which I can think of so many exceptions that then it undermines the trust I have. I just this doesn't feel true. It doesn't feel true to my experience. What feels true to my experience is something that honors the complexity of the world in which we live in, and it may feel harder, but it's actually truer. That's my perspective, which is why I really like this anthro of ed approach, because it allows us to see more deeply past labels that might otherwise stop us from seeing these underlying phenomena. It expands, right, in this way then our notion of culture. It reduces then stereotyping. One of the things we talk about in multicultural ed is how in the 80s the approach to multicultural ed was a chapter in a textbook about different racial ethnic categories and what you need to do, which seemed like then the idea was you're supposed to step in your classroom, be looking like for who are the brown bodies, here's the things I need to do with them. And that didn't quite feel like a way that was descriptive at all. It was more prescriptive in how you were coming in and thinking about your work with those students without knowing anything more, right? than what they looked like to you as they were sitting in their chairs. Anthro of Ed focuses on processes and contexts. It centers inquiry, the idea that we don't have answers. It provides agency to teachers, and it actually provides agency to students and families because they're considered as having cultural contexts that are at play, but maybe marginalized due to power relationships, but nonetheless they come from cultural contexts as we do. And in this way it ensures humanism, that the work is always grounded in the idea of human development and social justice and social change. So an example, right, how to culturally responsive teaching would say something like, here's how you develop a positive attitude, here's the norms that you need to do, here's the procedure, here's the structure. I don't want to linger too long on that, except to just say this is the opportunity that you're being given to say, we are going to decide for ourselves what this work can mean for us. Now I'm really getting close, and then we'll get you into your work groups. So the why to, again, for me, and that I'm asking you to consider for culturally responsive teaching, is it really is asking you to learn to listen. So here we're sort of moving from observing to now to kind of listening because of a framework I want to show you, but we're learning to listen for these transitions that are happening in the lives of youth, for transactions, places where culture in those transitions is either coming into contact, conflict, or culture is actually changing, which is the exciting work that culture does in multicultural spaces. And that's that last piece around transformation, where sometimes actually we're able to change things that happen in schools and classrooms when we see the ways that cultures are naturally sort of interacting and creating something new. And that newness can be part of what we embrace in a structure. And that's the way that we change the structure, is by pressing on it and listening to change from the ground up. So this is another Anthro of Ed person. This is Kathy Schultz, her conceptual framework for listening to teach. So you're listening to know your particular students. You're listening to the rhythm and balance of the classroom. You're listening to the social, cultural, and community context of students' lives. And you're listening for silence and for acts of silencing, which is hard sometimes, but Facing History is good at this. It actually fine-tunes our abilities to listen for what's been left out. Facing History is great at that. Okay, so then I have some pieces just around teacher action research, and I feel like I've already sold you on it. But I see teacher action research for culturally responsive teaching as really being a way to listen for silence because of what it says here about teachers asking questions, facing the discomfort of not knowing the answer to those questions. You have to live in the absence of an answer, which is learning to really listen for the silence that you're in around a particular question you may have and see that as part of your opportunity to work with your students. Okay, so there's pieces here. What time is it, Emily?
Yeah, I feel like this stuff would be helpful after they
Yeah.
get in. It's one,
Yeah.
So we have like an hour.
Yeah, this is great.
So yeah,
Yeah.
and I think this would help lay on top of when
Yeah, I
they
think
get
so.
a chance to look at
So
this.
let me get down to some stuff. Okay, so now we're really close. So this is the Facing History scope and sequence that was shown to you really, really briefly like 2 days ago at the very beginning. Okay, and the way that Facing History typically delivers professional development is to use a historical case study, like in Holocaust and human behavior, or immigration, citizenship, and belonging. And they have these, you can see, rich content resources with these really engaging pedagogical strategies. They use those case study materials to then have you ask questions about the role of the individual in society, these dynamics of us and them, right? You kind of, and you recognize that a little bit in your work that you did with them, although you got something sort of new and different, which is work around cultural proficiency, not so much about a particular historical context, but you saw some of their work in terms of eugenics. So I'm asking us to consider then our work as facing education in ourselves, right? So that we're exploring the intersection of the individual and society in our own classrooms and communities. So now our classrooms and communities become the case study around which the rest of this inquiry can take place, right? And then when I do that overlay between facing history in ourselves and facing education in ourselves, right, we get sort of this crosstalk between questions, which maybe we'll bring up a little bit later, but I want you to see that I've done it. And so now is the time, because we want to give you time, and an hour is a good amount of time, for you to think what it would mean for you to sort of take teacher action to listen, like in my case. Meaning in my case, what I love about teacher action research, it's very particular. So he talked about the tension between the universal and the particular, Brian did. So teacher action research really embraces the particularity of your classroom and your practice, okay? So what does it mean to listen in your case? And the steps for thinking about action research has you start for a vision, developing a vision for teaching and learning. And we're here because, I'm tagging this as learning to be culturally responsive teachers, right? That's why you're all here. But a way that we may think about this is like, what are the we and they dynamics affecting my educating? Like, what's happening for you right now in your practice that in somehow is a reflection of we and they, of border crossing, of transitions being successful or not successful? And what I think we should do here is have each of you individually just begin to make some notes where you're just responding to this question in terms of what could be an essential question for you to design action research around. And then I'll pull you out of that individual reflection and have you do some talking. And then we're going to talk about then how to take those ideas and turn them into what actually is a researchable question, and what kind of data you would have an opportunity to collect in order to answer that question, and where that answer might take you in this work.